This is the Latin News Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest is on the line from the northeastern United States. This is Martín Mendoza-Botelho, who's a professor of political science at the Eastern Connecticut State University. He's also from Bolivia, and that's why we'll be discussing, the outcomes of the recent election there and what we can look forwards for the country. And so, Martín, welcome on the Latin News Podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward to this discussion.
Well, no, it's great because, as I say, Bolivia, we know a lot. We know bits here and there. Everybody knows Evo Morales. But perhaps let's start with the second round of the elections, which was kind of groundbreaking when we saw Rodrigo Paz. Well, he was the victor against Jorge Tuto Quiroga. So we're looking at two figures in Bolivian politics of right and center right. They faced off, and Rodrigo Paz was the victor.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting development. I think part of the challenge was to identify who was profiling as their runner-up and who was going to be Bolivia's next president. I think some of the challenges were the way in which political analysts address this issue. So everybody was curious about that. Rodrigo Paz was a bit of a surprise in the first round. Not too many. I think for some people, they saw that coming. It's not when we put this in a comparative Latin American context, we saw that in the past, right? So Fujimori kind of coming out of nowhere, becoming president of Peru. So it was a build-up moment that not that many analysts had the sensibility to catch that one. So the second round was a bit of a projection of this unknown of, what might not happen. And the same thing, it's easy to kind of do the ex post when the dead body's on the table and then you remove the organs. So I think, talking about organs, I think there are two types of elections in, Latin America and worldwide, right? So there's the elections where people vote with their heart and elections where people vote with the liver, right? And I think Bolivia, this election was a bit more on that side, right? So it's a liver vote, as in know who I like, but who I dislike the least, right? And I think when you look at the analysis, Tuto Quiroga reached a plateau, right? So Tuto Quiroga had a traditional political base built on, we'll talk about that, socioeconomics and regional interests. But I think his projection beyond that constituency was going to be a very difficult one. And Rodrigo Paz did what he was supposed to do as a leading candidate, but also as somebody that most Bolivians have hope in the sense that he will provide solutions to the economic foes and and some of the long-standing social and political issues. But a lot of people don't know much about what he's really actually after, right? And many of us were learning along the way for a number of reasons, right? And by now, probably people are realizing that there's not necessarily a solid party structure for Rodrigo Paz, right? So Rodrigo Paz is building on a personal political career. I would say a solid reputation because he was on the ground, not only for the campaign, but throughout his political career. So he's somebody that tries to kind of be seen as an empathic individual, not necessarily as one of them, because Rodrigo Paz comes from a unique background. But I think that, that second part of the election, what you saw was Tuto Quiroga reaching a plateau and Rodrigo Paz being a little bit mysterious in terms of what he's going to do next, right? So most of the political discourse was aimed at keeping, the electorate informed about his intentions of solving this, but there were no answers of how is this going to be solved. There were some creative answers. So now when the time comes, how much can the electorate make him accountable for what he promised? And I'll mention some of them later on. But I think what he was successful was to kind of keeping this relatively calm profile and also kind of not antagonizing other political forces. And one of them, you mentioned Evo Morales, and Evo Morales is still an unknown card in the Bolivian political system. And there were some signs of some sort of acceptance of this, Rodrigo Paz as a potential front runner, right? Because when you look at the statistical numbers of the election, or not the statistical, but the electoral results, something that was very noticeable in the campaign was the dismantling of mass, right? So mass fractioning into different forces. It's it would be easy to say, let's put the parties on the left, let's parties on the right. But I think when you look at MAS, the fragmentation had to do with personality clashes, internal rivalries, personal ambitions, right? So we have Eva Copa, the mayor of El Alto, profiling as an interesting candidate, but then early on she realized that it's going to be a bit of too much of a gamble, considering her historical ties with MAS and the popular dissatisfaction with this last period of MAS. Then you have Andrónico Rodriguez with his intention of promoting his own style leadership, trying to detach himself from Evo Morales. That I wouldn't say that cost him dearly, because he ended up, with some important numbers to give him space in the political discussions at least. And Del Castillo representing MAS and the Arcista branch that he did not that well, but at least he was able to save the legal figure of MAS, and that allows MAS to have a potential continuity over time, which was not the case of two historical parties that lost their label, right? So one is the ADN, the famous right-wing party founded by former president, former dictator Hugo Banzer Suarez, and the other one is the populist party, the UCS, founded by Max Fernandez, the owner of the Bolivian beer company, and that and his son, currently mayor of Santa Cruz, inherits, and he didn't put a good use to that label. So those two labels are going to be retired, but MAS continues. Sorry, I don't want to expand too much on these initial comments, but you ask us. So I think it's a well-deserved victory in terms of the political strategy, right? So in a way, keeping that unknown of what's going to be next. One element in the election was, that a lot of people were paying attention was emerging political figures. And I think both Rodrigo Paz and Tuto Quiroga had the same kind of instinct to moving or finding running mates that would have an appeal beyond their traditional political structures and, things that Bolivians would pay attention to. Initially, Rodrigo Paz had a different candidate in mind. So he approached a civic leader in Potosí to see if he would be, a young entrepreneur, seeing if he would be willing to do that. And he had I would say, change of heart, but I think he was flirting with this possibility, but he moved towards the Doria Medina campaign. And, I'm wondering if he's thinking twice, stick to, Rodrigo Paz's initial approach. But then Rodrigo Paz approached Edman Lara and Tuto Quiroga JP Velázquez, and they both have this kind of reach that is this emerging trend. Again, I don't think it's unique to Latin America, but I think worldwide, of these young individuals that have a good command of media, and not necessarily, we're talking about social media, but not necessarily the traditional use of social media, right? So in a way, there's some things that appeal viewers or keep people in their phones looking at what they do, and they have that direct reach. And I think Lara had that kind of unique. If you look at some of his TikToks and videos and stuff, he starts some of the discussions showing what he's having for dinner or what the meal that he's having in a small town in Bolivia. He describes the flavors and so on, and then he jumps into into his political commentary, and that fits well with the young audience that is kind of using different sources of information. And I think one of the risks, or at least some of the campaign managers would have seen, is Lara's very strong take on a couple of things and his potential undermining of Paz as his running mate, right? And I think Lara kept it, quite enough that he did not, raise that many eyebrows in terms of saying the wrong things and so on, and a couple of controversial things, but I think he was subdued enough that actually his presence was useful to Rodrigo Paz. I think he, that part of electoral, it's find some sort of comfort in this, some sort of empathy of a potential leader, right? So how much of that is populist, how much is genuine, time will tell. But I think he cannot be underestimated as somebody with a growing base and a wider reach. So it's a good balance to Rodrigo Paz, who has a lifelong political career, and clearly Rodrigo Paz is a leader with a purpose, right? So he's he comes from a political family. I think Angus McNeil, your guest in the last podcast, explained a little bit of those connections. But what is clear is that Rodrigo Paz has, at least personally, has a blueprint of, where should the country follow. The challenge is going to be how much he can transform that blueprint into a political structure project, and what might happen next.
It's such an interesting situation. We discuss all of this, of course, and we're talking about Rodrigo Paz, but the specter of Mas and Evo Morales is never far from the conversation. Even to get to here in our conversation, we had to discuss Evo Morales and of course the links to Mas and so on. Of course, we know that he's holed up in Chapare, and also we've discussed the personality really here of Edmund Lara, and during the campaign that he was able to kind of keep a lid on some of his more outspoken opinions. But of late, I don't think he's come out saying that the president-elect hasn't taken his phone calls and so on, and he's very active on TikTok. And this is the mark of an incredibly ambitious politician as well. So we kind of hope, and you mentioned right at the beginning that Rodrigo Paz has a unique background, and so when we look at his unique background, is he going to have the personality to hold on in what is I would say it's Bolivian politics is nothing if unstable, let's say. Is Rodrigo Paz going to be able to see the duration with people like, obviously, Evo Morales? He does command a lot of opinion and a lot of support, despite the fact, obviously, Mas's reduction, the decline, but it still exists. And then, of course, with someone like Edmund Lara beside him.
Yeah, I think it's it's interesting to see how Evo Morales is trying to position himself in this new political environment, right? If you want to move to the Evo Morales discussion, right? So when you look at his participation, his unofficial participation in the elections, let's call it. So and what happens in Bolivia is and people that study Bolivia are, you pick up these things really quickly. If you're Bolivian, you actually live that story. But Bolivia's many Bolivias, right? So one is the formal side of things, institutional, political, and so on, right? And the other one is the informal side, right? So when you look at the formal side of, of politics, and you see the elections, the candidates, and so on, and then you see the informal side of politics, like what is in the mind of voters, the voting styles, right? So which are very different, right? So where you have one style in urban places where people would have a sense of, more the idea of, their idea of democracy is this individual exercise. And then you see, in other places, communities that have this sense of collective democracy, right? So even there are discussions about who should we vote for, right? So when you add the word we, it's like, as a group kind of thing. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but it's a different type of, Bolivia. So I think when you look at Evo Morales' participation in the election, one of his frustrations, and has to do with the Bolivian institutional settings, was he was not allowed to run in this election, right? I mean, and one of the reasons that he was not allowed is that because there were some rulings by both the Bolivian Constitutional Tribunal, Plurinational Tribunal, right, and the other one was the Supreme Electoral Tribunal as well, right? So they both agreed that Evo Morales was not allowed to run for a third term, right? Which is, in the case of the Constitution, is an interpretation of the Constitution, right? It's not necessarily what the written Constitution said, right? So again, this gives a space to say this was perhaps a political ruling, right? So again, the Constitutional Tribunal has the faculty to interpret the Constitution in their own terms, but again, it's an interpretation, right? And the Constitutional Tribunal has been reversing some of the rulings, and when you look at the 2019 crisis, you see how the rulings evolved as the balance of power evolved, right? So in terms of his participation, when Morales kind of, his intention was to kind of undermine the process, there were some fears that this would lead into high political instability, but I don't think he has the muscle anymore to kind of mobilize large groups, and and part of that is the economic situation. But Morales clearly, recommended his followers to have the voto nulo, right? So the null votes as a way, as a sign of dissatisfaction with the whole process and his candidacy. So basically he said, if the null vote gets more votes than the first candidate, that means I technically won the election, right? So you're talking about the formal and informal Bolivia, right? So if they don't let my followers go through the proper channels, we'll do this alternative way of, doing politics by the voto nulo kind of thing, right? And when you look at the electoral results, Bolivia had a very unusual high voto nulo, right? So it's almost like 20% in the first round. And when you look at when you zoom in and then, just out of curiosity, you look at the small or these regions of support, and then you say, look, what happened here is a fragmentation of mass. So there's a possibility that one side might still be loyal to Morales and one side might still be, might thinking of mass alternatives like Andrónico Rodriguez, right? So when you look, for example, I was just playing with some numbers, and when you look at Villatunari and Chapare, right? So like around 50,000+ people, right? Let me get I think I have it somewhere. I want to give the number right, but you had 84% null votes, right? So we're talking about like some sort of loyalty to the, to that request from their Cocalero leader, saying, let's boycott the process, right? Very small locality where he's placed, and there are even these mediatic kind of scenes of followers holding on, using their arms as some sort of like a personal body security, so Morales can go and vote and not be arrested. And the Bolivian police was very proud of arresting a few individuals with indictions with Interpol related to drug trafficking and other crimes and so on. So some individuals were arrested at the time of voting, right? But Morales was not disturbed at all, because there's no entrance of the formal Bolivian state in those areas of support, right? So what it's telling you is that there is still some strong support, very geographically localized, and it's one of those things that you cannot undermine that, because this might be localized, but there's still some following in other parts of the country. So the voto nulo was present throughout the country, right? So what might come next is, it's tricky because Morales has a couple of many things going on at the time. Obviously, the big issue for him is the legal processes pending against him for statutory rape, right? And that is that's a criminal offense that has to, in other words, in a country with the rule of law, you would detach that criminal, offense from any political siding, which is part of the other processes that he might have, right? So in a way, Morales was accused of agitating and conspiring against the state, and those can be seen under different lenses. But the point is that Bolivian justice is so undermined, the capacity of the state is so weak, that this process should be very straightforward, right? So in a modern case, you say, look, if there's an allegations, you have the victim, you have the proof, and either you prove it or you don't, right? One of the alleged victims, I said alleged because this is an process in an investigation, seek political asylum in Argentina, and he was granted, right? So this political asylum was granted, and the child of this relationship, and there's records of birth certificates with the names and all the registration. But again, if you think about a DNA testing or something that would validate, that's a process that should be left to the justice. But now this whole thing is stalled because it's too much of a hot potato to kind of open up this possibility, right? So I think Morales' intention of gaining power is to kind of use his new political powers to leverage a little bit of like this leeway in terms of, these criminal accusations. But then there's this other side, right? So the political rebuild and his long-term ambition. So I think it's kind of how to conciliate these things and, in other words, survive this processes, get some sort of immunity, but it's very unlikely. So when you ask about Rodrigo Paz having the strength to do it, it's not that he has the strength, but he does not have much choice, because it's either that or giving in into Morales's game of kind of, if you don't do this, we'll do this. If we'll withdraw our support, and actually your voters are mass voters, and this kind of like back and forth cannot continue for too long, right? So Rodrigo Paz, I think he has that very clear, that he has to act emphatically about this and that mobilize support in that area. And I think he's going to get support from his now political adversaries, right? So I think there's a commonality in terms of minimizing the Morales variable in Bolivian politics in the short run, at least if you want to bring some stability and make some changes.
And of course, we've mentioned, and you mentioned, the unpopularity of Morales, of course, coming due to the situation with Bolivia's economy. So there's no honeymoon period for Rodrigo Paz when he comes in. He needs to address this situation, but straight away. You said that he was kind of, I would say, obscure on his plans or creative with his plans when he was on the campaign trail. What can we expect from President-elect Paz with regards to this?
Yeah, I think one of the main issues, and and there are things that are, in politics are the things that are visible and the things that are under the rug. I'll deal with them later, kind of thing. The very immediate need of Bolivia is, well, there are two things that are on the minds of most Bolivians. And I was on the phone with a good friend of mine, and I was able to have a nice conversation because he was in one of these gas lines waiting to get gas, and so he's a lawyer. And he spent 6 hours working in his car because he was hoping to get some gasoline to keep going, right? So again, I'm bringing my friend as an emblematic example because the issue of the scarcity of fuel, gasoline and diesel, is created an enormous disruption in Bolivia's economy, and this has different roots, and the solutions also could be different, could be creative, and so on. So the root of the scarcity is there are two compounding issues. One is the hydrocarbon subsidies and the traditional monopoly of the hydrocarbon distribution by the government, which was managed with a relatively, I won't say efficiency, but normality under the mass administration, because one, there was enough resources to kind of make transactions. Bolivia imports most of its diesel because the kind of hydrocarbons that Bolivia produces are not necessarily economically viable to produce diesel. And that's why, for example, Morales, some of the industrialization plans that were also continued by Arce was the creation of biodiesel plants and in parts of the country. But that's a long term, not necessarily a bad idea, but it's a long term that is not giving solutions right away. So the immediate one is how to solve the crisis in the providing fuel. And what is exacerbating because that affects public transport, affects the productive sector. Bolivia's economy is contracting at a very high rate, right? And one way in which Arce was able to kind of at least postpone the inevitable was the use of Bolivia's large reserves, right? And so including the gold reserves, and there's been some sort of like accounting exercises in the central bank that is very kind of creative in the sense of like, oh, we're not selling those, our reserves, but we're just putting them on hold, and we're getting money, we're getting money from those reserves, but when we have the money back, we'll pay them. So technically they still belong to us anyway. So there's a lot of like creative management in the national accounts, but the reality is that the level of reserves is extremely low. So that's not an option in the short run. So the option is like, how do we generate fresh cash to solve this immediate need? Tuto Quiroga was very clear about his already negotiations with the IMF, World Bank, in terms of the different types of loans available to us, which expand also to the regional banks, right? The Inter-American Development Bank and the Andean Development Corporation. So they're all kind of willing to, bring some resources to Bolivia, but that's not free money, right? Mm-hmm. So that's money that's going to come with conditionalities, and that might affect the flexibility in terms of managing, economic policy in a country that is in deep crisis. That has to do with a very bloated state. So some of the recent studies came out, and they estimate the Bolivian public employee, I don't want to call it necessarily bureaucracy because that might have a different connotation, but the Bolivian sector or the Bolivian workers employed by the state is around 600,000. So it's a relatively large number for the country. And again, it's just in terms of the political strategy. I'm not saying, the challenge is that this might work with a very state-sponsored type of model, as long as that state is efficient, right? So you can ask Norway, you can ask Sweden, but this is Bolivia, right? So this is a state that is heavily reliant on a few sources of income at the moment, and all the industrial ambitions have not really prospered. Lithium is one of them, right? So the lithium adventure had to do with it goes down to the technical aspects of lithium extraction, right? So Bolivia gambled, and again, we say gamble because there's you can look at the technical reports, but Bolivia used one type of technology that it was kind of phasing out, right? So the one with the pools that you bring the lithium reserve, which is underneath the Salar de Uyuni, into these pools, you let them dry by evaporation, and then you process them, and those pools did not produce as they were. And the other technology, the alternative one, requires extensive use of water, and so Bolivia doesn't have the infrastructure at the moment to provide the water needs. It's an area that is in a drought period, and if Bolivia would start diverting water resources to the production of lithium, it would create a bilateral conflict with Chile, because the northern part of Chile relies on, on water resources coming from that part that practically started in Bolivia. So it's a bit of a mess to kind of switch technologically lithium production. So that's not in the table at the moment. Sorry, I don't want to get too go in the tangent, but so when you think about the immediate needs, some fresh resources in the form of, foreign currency need to arrive in Bolivia to solve the hydrocarbons in the short run, right? One of his creative solutions, and again, it's interesting to see how this, the center-right kind of mind tries to combine different sources. And Rodrigo Paz has a very key term, he calls it the Estado tranca, right? So it's a state that gets in the middle, right? So it's the state that impedes the entrepreneurship of Bolivians to kind of emerge, right? And the Estado tranca, it's, in different stages. And one of these elements of the Estado tranca is this monopoly of the hydrocarbons and so on, right? So one of the creative solutions that I've heard, and there was a very interesting economic forum with not the candidates, but some of the I would say top advisors of the candidates, was related to discriminate markets in Bolivia, right? So they say the hydrocarbons, we have one sector that, deserves to be subsidized. That's very related to the transport, the small buses, the mini buses. Most of public transport in Bolivia is private in a way, it's publicly regulated, but private, right? So it's the owner of a little minibus or a taxi and so on, right? So in a way, discriminate those users of hydrocarbons that might be deserving of the, the subsidy and, public services and so on from other users, private, owners of vehicles and so on. But you have the unknowns, right? So for example, you have, should the state subsidize the big agricultural producers, the soy producers in Santa Cruz and those areas, right? It could be beneficial to the country to subsidize them, right? Because they bring resources that create they create employment, make this sector more dynamic. But how much of this subsidized do they really need? And how much are we, a state that has to count its pennies? In Bolivia, it's centavos, right? To make it clear, how much of a, government that has to count their centavos should be kind of subsidizing a dynamic economic sector, right? And one of the proposals was interesting, was saying, for example, in the case of public transport, you have the public buses, right? So why don't we have a GPS type of system that is, so every bus is registered, so that gives a sense of like how much this, bus operated following its expected public routes and so on. And based on that, right, when you go to the gas station, there's a system that somehow reads that label and says, this is a public transport, so the cost of gasoline for you would be different than the one next door. How do we avoid these guys filling up the tank and, reselling it 2 blocks away from the gas station? So there's another speculation in terms of gas. So they're kind of like finding ways to kind of discriminate the market. And again, it's logistically, it's going to be very difficult. So I think you can envision that in the long run, but the immediate need might require the borrowing of some resources to really cover the whole until, long-term solutions can be done. And to end briefly, the other immediate need is US dollars, right? So the US dollars is the scarcity of US dollars has enormous implications, right? Because it's not only individuals not being able to get US dollars for transactions, travel abroad, or whatever needs they might have, but the Bolivian system is based on this dual currency system, right? So many Bolivians would have savings accounts or other type of investments in US dollars, and those are paralyzed, right? And people don't want to move their money because right now, if you use the official exchange rates, you will lose a significant portion of those savings. So part of the financial system is tied to the US dollar, right? It's not officially, we don't officially use as a currency, but it's tied to that one. So that kind of economic dissatisfaction has to be solved. And again, the challenge is how to generate enough currency, fresh currency, to keep this system more dynamic, right? So some of the projections, when you look at the growth and inflation numbers, they're scary, right? Because Bolivia was a successful case of avoiding inflation even during time of COVID. And that was, part of that skillful management, but part of that was the use of, reserves and, keeping the U.S. currency at a fixed price that, that gave some stability in the markets, but you cannot do that anymore, right? There's no reserves to kind of sustain that system. So the US dollar is going to, in Bolivia, the phrase is, make the dollar honest, in the sense that we have to use the honest price, the market price of US dollar, and that's going to create, a devaluation of the Boliviano, and that devaluation is going to have a direct, immediate impact in inflation. So some of the expectations for inflation from being in the low numbers of 3-4% in 2021, 2022, 5% 2024, to a potential 20%, and 25% is, and I studied economics, so for economists, it's a very worrisome sign, because if you jump from 5 to 20%, the jump from inflationary to hyperinflationary cycles is not that far, right? So in a way, 20% is not that it will stop there. 20% will generate another adjustment, and it create a vicious circle. GDP growth is calculated right now. The estimations are between 1 and -1%, depends on the, when you look at the indicators. And when you compare Bolivia and the region, it's not that it's a regional phenomenon. The region is kind of expected to not the best growth, but it's going to average like around 3%, with, Paraguay and Ecuador growing faster, Peru stable. So Bolivia is becoming the outlier from being the stable country to one country that is projected at an economic contraction, right? And that's going to undermine some of the gains of the mass administration, right? And some of the big gains in economic terms was lifting an important segment of the people out of poverty. So those rates dropped importantly because of some efforts to redistribute resources, but that people are at the margin, right? So this, when you have inflationary effects, those sectors are going to be the first ones to be affected. So poverty can return to Bolivia in significant way. So Rodrigo Paz has to deal with this, in a very skillful way, to allow these economic transitions without harming a large segments of the population, mostly the poor sectors of Bolivia.
I imagine the poor sectors up in El Alto and around Cochabamba, Potosí. We're talking of the highlands rather than down in the Sierra. But this is an interesting point to bring in, and I guess it was sort of the final points of our conversation here. We've talked a lot about the US dollar, but we have to talk about the relationship with the United States. Of course, there hasn't really been a formal diplomatic relationship since 2008, and the fact that Rodrigo Paz is center right obviously puts him into the favorable crosshairs for President Trump and his administration in the United States, not being of the left. So perhaps there is some sort of relationship that can occur that's beneficial to Bolivia. Let's say the renovation of a diplomatic and economic relationship. How do you feel on this?
That's a very interesting. That's a very interesting take, right? Let's not forget that Evo Morales, big jump into politics, had to do with some controversial, comments by then the former U.S. ambassador in Bolivia, Manuel Rocha, right? And as we know now, Manuel Rocha was discovered that he was a double agent for Cuba. So it's like a very kind of shocking element. So how much of those comments were made as a way to propel, these emerging leftist, candidates. So in other words, there's this kind of there's a very conflicted beginning to this, or Bolivia distancing from the U.S. But at the same time, I think the U.S. presence was a very important political variable at the time of Morales' ascension to power, right? So I think now Bolivia is trying to kind of revisit those relationships, and I think that's Rodrigo Paz has been very emphatic about it. The new, the change in foreign policy. And for many, it's refreshing, right? It's refreshing in the sense of having, a diplomatic agenda that it responds most to the interests of the country. So regardless of the political ideologies, right? So what is more convenient economically for Bolivia as opposed to what is more convenient politically, right? And at the time, right now, it's difficult to tell because Bolivia has very strong ties with China in terms of economic expansion, very limited ties with with other countries in the region. So right now, for example, Rodrigo Paz made it public that he's not going to invite to the inauguration to the presidents of Nicaragua, Cuba, or Venezuela. And Maduro got really upset about this for obvious reasons. He wanted to be invited and he's not. But the retaliation was to isolate Bolivia from the ALBA. So Bolivia was suspended from this kind of conglomerate of countries that are aligned ideologically, right? With the Bolivarian, or let's call it the interpretation of the Bolivarian ideal by Venezuelans. But that's getting a much more pragmatic foreign policy, right? So Bolivia's approach to the U.S. is a sign of opening, and I think Bolivia has the contextual elements that are helping in this transition. One is Milei's kind of good reception in U.S. political circles, right? Marco Rubio is very pleased with Milei's stand against socialist attempts in the region and his efforts to kind of reshape Argentina. So Bolivia is being put in the same kind of category. Time will tell, but Bolivia is getting this attention of we're regaining an ally that move away from socialism, and it's, welcome back to this side of the club. But there are higher interests behind, right? So I think Bolivia cannot be naive and say, this friendly approach by the U.S. has no, strings attached. And I think part of that is, the U.S. interest in kind of regaining traction in the, in the region, right? I mean, so far it's been relatively slow, besides, significant, moves aimed at one particular country, Venezuela here, right? But besides that, the agenda is a bit stalled, right? So U.S., Mexico are in the, are very cold at the moment, despite their enormous, trade interdependence. So for a country like Bolivia, this moving away from that is creating new opportunities, but it has to be done very carefully, right? So Bolivia is seen with good eyes by Washington, which kind of Bolivia could use that to their advantage. But at the same time, it has to kind of continue certain relationships, especially with China, that has a very important economic presence in the region through not only traditional trade, but also by investments that are doing, right? So MAS gave enormous access to resources to its Chinese counterpart. So, and that has to be revisited. And again, that's not something that could happen overnight. So I don't think you can cut these relationships early on. And another element important for Bolivia is regional, the influence of our regional partners, right? And Bolivia neglected those regional partners because of ideological considerations. And so, in other words, Bolivia has enormous things to gain with, expanding or normalizing relationships with Peru. Chile, it's a very problematic one because of, I think, us Bolivians are still, unwilling to go further until we give a long-term solution to the, the Pacific Access dilemma. But, places like Argentina and Brazil, those are our strategic partners, and somehow they're competitors as well, right? So when you look at lithium, Argentina and Chile are very efficient producers of lithium. So they're not going to be, very supportive if Bolivia wants to move in that path, or Bolivia can go and approach them as potential strategic partners. But again, what is this change of government, what is bringing is a new set of possibilities to reshape Bolivian foreign policy, and hopefully it's going to be a bit much more pragmatic as opposed to ideological. And I think Bolivia was used to these 20 years of ideological foreign policy, and Bolivia aligned heavily with countries like Iran and Cuba and so on. And I think the MAS leadership saw a virtue on those relationships, but in practical terms, they not bring much economic advantage and specific things.
I think that's it, isn't it? We look at a pragmatism over ideology, hopefully, for the Rodrigo Paz presidency, despite the evident message that there will be an economic contraction in the country. But it's tough for everywhere right now, of course. But hopefully, can we say that the outlook? Are you positive? As we understand it, I know that you obviously you work on this, and you are Bolivian, and throw some of the objectivity out of the window and say, as a Bolivian, I feel positive towards the next few years.
Yeah, I think many of my fellow Bolivians would agree with me is that we have to be positive. That we don't have a choice, right? The choice is to go in despair and see things in a negative way, and we have to be positive, because what this presidency brings is the potential of change, and change can always, there's always the potential of change bringing positive new things. I think being positive doesn't mean being naive in terms of what might be coming, right? So, and what is very clear is that there are some very difficult economic times are heading our way, perhaps more significant than we've been experiencing, because those changes could be very painful, right? So one, for example, I mentioned we have a bloated state in terms of number of individuals that depend economically from salaries provided by the state. You have new actors coming back in the forefront, like the historical Central Obrera Boliviana, that is the traditional organization that defends workers' rights, now is finding a regained role by trying to be the advocate for public employees, right? So the COP is going to be trying to become a new actor in politics. And again, when you ask me, can I be positive? It's like, yeah, if we can be positive if all these institutions start, doing what they are supposed to do, right? So the Bolivian government brings his accounts back in shape, becomes more realistic in terms of what can to be implemented, try to kind of build on things that were some, positive elements left from, the economic investments in the past. Bolivian infrastructure is in better shape. I'm sure you travel around Bolivia, and so roads that connect and bridges do exist despite the, mismanagement of an enormous amount of funds. So that's undeniable that many funds were wasted and, and other things, but some of the resources provided, some good opportunities. So it's time for Bolivia to don't kind of try to erase everything from the past and do everything new. I think there's optimism in the sense of try to kind of make a gradual, well-thought process of transition. And if Rodrigo Paz want to make the Estado tranca less tranca, he's in charge. So he can do the little changes to make his idea of capitalism and his more democratic capitalism a reality, right? So allowing Bolivians to be creative and entrepreneurial and bring that prosperity. So there is some optimism.
I have to say, it's, regarding Bolivia and regarding this podcast, is perhaps the most positive episode that we've had on Bolivia in the couple of years that we've been reporting this way. So always nice to end on an upbeat message there. But let me say thank you so much to you, Martín Mendoza-Botelho, Professor of Political Science at the Eastern Connecticut State University. It has been a fantastic conversation about, let's look for a positive outcome and potential for Bolivia in coming years. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Richard. And you can hold me accountable in a year time about my my positive outlook. But let's see. But I think we can be hopeful and say, maybe this is a chance for positive change. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. I've been Richard McCall here for the LatinNews Podcast. Of course, remember to subscribe and share and speak about the podcast. We will be back in 2 weeks' time discussing further issues and items from the region. Thank you again, and bye-bye.